Some humiliations cut so deep they change not just one life, but an entire town's understanding of what truly matters. Clara Mae Holt knew that kind of pain the moment her groom turned his back on her at the altar. Tommy Grier looked at her in front of everyone and said he couldn't go through with it. The whispers and laughter spread through the church like wildfire. Then a rough voice broke through the shame. Silas Boone, a quiet mountain man who kept to himself in the high country, stepped forward with words nobody expected. "If he won't have her, I will." The church went silent. What started as the worst day of Clara's life became something far different, a story that would challenge everything Redemption Creek believed about love and worth. Could dignity be found in the last place anyone thought to look? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months before that terrible day at the altar, Clara Mae Holt had stood in the same church for Sunday service, watching the young couples file in with their children. She'd smoothed down the fabric of her best dress, the blue one that her mother had made before the fever took her, and tried not to notice the way people's eyes slid past her, as if looking directly at her might be unkind. Redemption Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Clara's business had been the subject of parlor conversation for as long as she could remember. "Such a sweet girl," the women would say, their voices dropping to that particular tone reserved for discussing misfortunes. It's a shame about her size. Her mother was the same way, God rest her soul. Clara had learned early that being large in a small town meant carrying more than just extra weight. She carried the whispers, the sideways glances, the well-meaning advice about eating less and moving more, as if she hadn't tried every remedy the traveling medicine shows had to offer. She carried the knowledge that she was considered unfortunate, undesirable, and though no one would say it directly to her face, unlikely to marry. Her father, Samuel Holt, ran the boarding house on the edge of town, and Clara had spent her 26 years helping him manage it. She cooked meals that boarders praised, kept the rooms clean and welcoming, and handled the accounts with a steady hand and sharp mind. The boarding house had a reputation for being the most comfortable place to stay in Redemption Creek, and that reputation rested largely on Clara's shoulders. Samuel had grown slower with age, his hands stiff with arthritis, his memory occasionally foggy. Clara had gradually taken on more responsibility until she was running the business in all but name. She didn't mind. The work gave her purpose, and the boarders, mostly traveling merchants and the occasional cowhand between jobs, treated her with casual respect. To them, she was simply the woman who made sure their beds were clean and their meals were hot. It was one of those traveling merchants who'd introduced Tommy Grier to the boarding house. Tommy worked at the Fletcher Ranch, managing their horse trading operation, and he'd needed a place to stay while conducting business in town. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with sandy hair and an easy smile that he used liberally. Clara had noticed him, of course. Any woman would have, but she'd learned not to let herself hope for things that weren't meant for someone like her. So she'd simply done her job, serving his meals and making sure his room was comfortable, treating him no differently than any other boarder. What surprised her was that Tommy noticed her back. He'd started staying longer than his business required, taking meals in the dining room when he could have eaten at the ranch. He'd linger after dinner, helping her clear plates and asking about her day. He made her laugh with stories about the difficult horses he'd worked with. And he listened, really listened, when she talked about the books she'd been reading or her ideas for improving the boarding house. "You're smarter than half the men I know," he told her one evening. And the compliment had glowed warm in her chest for days. The courtship, if it could be called that, had progressed slowly. Tommy would find reasons to come to town, to stop by the boarding house, to seek out Clara's company. He never seemed bothered by her size, never made the jokes or comments she'd grown accustomed to from others. He treated her like she mattered, like she was worth pursuing. When he'd finally asked if he could court her properly, Clara had felt something she'd long ago stopped allowing herself to feel: hope, Samuel had been cautiously pleased. "The Fletcher ranch is prosperous," he'd said carefully. "Tommy's got a good position there. He could provide for you well." Clara knew what her father wasn't saying, that the boarding house would eventually need to be sold, that he was getting too old to maintain it, and that Clara would need somewhere to go. A husband would solve that problem. But she'd wanted to believe it was more than that. She'd wanted to believe Tommy saw something in her worth loving. The town had buzzed with surprise when word got out about the courtship. Tommy Grier and Clara Holt? She'd overheard at the mercantile. Well, I suppose everyone deserves a chance at happiness. The tone had been kind. But Clara heard the underlying message. Even someone like you might find someone willing to overlook your flaws. She'd tried not to let it bother her. Tommy's attention felt real. He'd brought her wildflowers from the meadow. He'd asked her father's permission to propose. He'd presented her with his grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with a small, clear stone, and told her she'd made him happier than he'd thought possible. The wedding had been planned for late spring, when the weather was mild and the church could be decorated with fresh blooms. Clara had spent weeks altering her mother's wedding dress to fit her, carefully letting out seams and adding panels of matching lace. Every stitch had been sewn with hope, with dreams of the life she and Tommy would build together. But there had been signs, small ones, that she'd chosen to ignore. The way Tommy sometimes seemed distracted when they talked about the future. The way his smile occasionally didn't reach his eyes. The questions he'd asked about the boarding house, about its value, about what would happen to it when Samuel passed, about whether Clara would inherit it. She'd told herself she was being paranoid, that years of rejection had made her suspicious of genuine affection. Tommy loved her. He'd said so. He'd asked her to marry him. That was enough. What Clara didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Silas Boone had been watching her for years. Silas came down from his mountain cabin perhaps 4 times a year, always for the same reason, supplies. He'd arrive in town on foot or with a pack mule, make his purchases at the mercantile with few words, and disappear back into the high country before most people even realized he'd been there. He was a figure of quiet mystery in Redemption Creek. Some said he'd been a soldier once. Others claimed he was running from something. The children told stories about the wild mountain man who could talk to wolves and survive winters that would kill ordinary men. The truth was simpler and lonelier. Silas had come west after the war, looking for a place where he didn't have to see or be seen. The mountains had offered him that peace. He'd built his cabin with his own hands, learned to live off the land, and carved out an existence that required nothing from anyone. But he'd noticed Clara. It had been 3 years ago, during one of his supply runs. He'd been at the mercantile, counting out coins for flour and coffee, when he'd heard raised voices outside. 3 young men, ranch hands by the look of them, had been taunting someone. Silas had glanced out and seen Clara, her arms full of packages, her face red with humiliation, as the men made jokes about how much she must eat to maintain her size. He'd been about to turn away. It wasn't his business. And he'd learned long ago that involving himself in town affairs only brought trouble. When Clara had stopped walking, she turned to face the men, her chin lifted despite the tears in her eyes. "You're right," she'd said quietly. "I am large, and you're cruel. I can change my size if I work at it. What will you do about your character?" The men had laughed, but it had sounded forced. Clara had walked on, maintaining her dignity even as they'd continued their mockery. Silas had followed at a distance, watching to make sure she got home safely. When one of the men had made as if to follow her, Silas had simply stepped into view. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't needed to. The look on his face and the knife at his belt had been enough. The ranch hands had found other entertainment. Clara had never known about that intervention. But Silas had remembered her words, her dignity in the face of cruelty, the way she'd refused to let them steal her self-respect, even as they'd stolen her peace. He'd found himself noticing her on subsequent trips to town. The way she smiled at the children who came to the boarding house with their traveling parents. The way she slipped extra food to the old prospector who couldn't always pay his full board. The way she existed in a town that barely saw her, maintaining her kindness despite having every reason to grow bitter. Silas had never spoken to her. What would he say? He was a ghost in these parts, and she was a woman of the town. Their worlds didn't intersect, and he'd learned long ago that some kinds of loneliness were meant to be permanent. But when he'd heard about her engagement to Tommy Grier, something in his chest had tightened. He'd told himself it was none of his concern. Clara deserved happiness, and if Tommy could give her that, then Silas was glad for her. Still, on the morning of the wedding, he'd found himself walking down from the mountain earlier than planned. He'd told himself he needed supplies anyway, that it was just coincidence that he'd arrive in town on her wedding day. He'd meant only to see her happy, to witness proof that good things could happen to good people, and then disappear back into his solitude with that small comfort. Instead, he'd arrived at the church just in time to hear Tommy Grier destroy her. The church was full that morning, packed with people who'd come as much to witness a spectacle as to celebrate a union. Half the town had turned out, and their voices created a low hum of conversation that filled the small wooden building with anticipation. Clara stood in the back room of the church, her hands trembling as she adjusted her mother's wedding dress one final time. The lace felt delicate under her fingers, and she could almost imagine her mother's hands had touched these same threads, smoothing them down on her own wedding day decades ago. The dress fit well enough, though Clara had needed to add panels to accommodate her frame. She'd chosen fabric that matched as closely as possible, and in the dim light of the room, you could hardly tell where the original ended and her additions began. Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, stood nearby, ostensibly to help with final preparations, but really to serve as witness to whatever was about to unfold. Her smile was kind, but carried that edge of pity Clara had learned to recognize. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, though her eyes told a different story. They held doubt, concern, and something that looked uncomfortably like foreknowledge. Clara's father appeared in the doorway, his best suit brushed clean, his sparse hair combed carefully across his head. His eyes were wet when he looked at his daughter. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, and Clara realized with a start that he'd been having doubts too. "We'll manage with the boarding house." "I shouldn't have encouraged this match so readily." "Papa, I want to marry him," Clara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt the tremor of uncertainty beneath them. "Tommy loves me. He chose me." Samuel Holt looked at his daughter with an expression that carried decades of watching the world hurt her and being unable to stop it. "Then let's not keep him waiting." The music started, the simple pump organ playing the wedding march that every bride in Redemption Creek had walked to. Clara took her father's arm and stepped into the main church, moving down the aisle between rows of familiar faces. She could feel their eyes on her. Some looked genuinely happy for her. Others wore expressions of curiosity, waiting to see how this unlikely ceremony would unfold. A few younger women whispered behind their hands, their glances sharp with something Clara couldn't quite name. Perhaps relief that they weren't in her position. Perhaps judgment that she dared to try, but Clara kept her eyes forward, focused on Tommy standing at the altar beside Reverend Matthews. Tommy wore his best clothes, his hair slicked back with pomade, his face carefully neutral as he watched her approach. It was that neutrality that first sparked fear in Clara's chest. A groom should look excited, nervous, happy, something. Tommy looked like a man watching a storm approach and calculating whether he could outrun it. She was halfway down the aisle when she saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. His hands, clasped in front of him, had gone white at the knuckles. His eyes darted to the side, looking at the door as if measuring the distance to escape. Clara's steps slowed. Her father's arm tightened under her hand, steadying her. "Keep walking," he murmured. "You're doing fine." But she wasn't fine, and some part of her knew that the entire church could see it. The whispers grew louder. The music seemed to stretch on forever, each note holding the weight of every doubt she'd tried to suppress during the courtship. When they finally reached the altar, Samuel placed Clara's hand in Tommy's. Tommy's palm was slick with sweat, and he didn't squeeze her fingers in return. He just stood there, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if all the months of courtship and conversation had been forgotten in this single moment. Reverend Matthews opened his Bible, his voice carrying across the church with practiced authority. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Tommy's breathing had gone shallow. Clara could hear it, quick and panicked, and her own breath started to match it, fear rising like floodwater in her chest. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," the Reverend continued, "but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Tommy pulled his hand away. The gesture was small, barely noticeable to those in the back pews, but to Clara it felt like being struck. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, silently begging him to explain, to reassure her that this was just nervousness, just a moment of cold feet that would pass. Instead, Tommy took a step backward. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the church. The organ music died. Every conversation stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. "I can't do this." Clara felt the words like physical blows. Her vision narrowed until all she could see was Tommy's face, twisted with something between guilt and revulsion. "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "I tried," Tommy said, and now his voice had taken on a defensive edge, as if he needed to justify himself to the watching crowd. "I really tried, Clara, but I can't stand here and promise forever to someone when I can't even—" He stopped himself, but the damage was already done. Everyone in the church could fill in the rest of that sentence. Clara's father moved forward, his face red with anger. "You cowardly—" "I'm being honest," Tommy interrupted, his voice rising. "That's more than some would do. I could have gone through with it, taken her and the boarding house, and spent the rest of my life regretting it. Instead, I'm being truthful. I can't marry her." "I won't." The word "her" carried so much weight, so much emphasis, that Clara felt herself shrinking under it. Not you, not Clara. Just her, as if she were an object, a problem, a burden too heavy to bear. The laughter started somewhere in the middle pews, a nervous titter that spread like a disease. It mixed with gasps and whispers, and the shuffling of feet as people shifted in their seats. Half appalled and half entertained by the drama unfolding before them, Clara stood frozen, her mother's wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume, like she'd been playing at something she was never meant to have. The ring, Tommy's grandmother's ring that she'd worn so proudly for the last 3 months, felt like it was burning her finger. Tommy reached out and, with a gesture so casual it bordered on cruel, took the ring back. He didn't ask. He simply grasped her hand, slid the ring off, and pocketed it as if retrieving property that had been temporarily loaned. "I'm sorry," he said again, but this time he wasn't even looking at her. He was looking at the crowd, performing his regret for their benefit. "I should have been honest sooner." He turned and walked down the aisle, his boots loud on the wooden floor, leaving Clara standing at the altar with her father's arm around her shoulders and the weight of every mocking eye in Redemption Creek on her back. The whispers grew louder. Someone laughed outright. Mrs. Patterson made a small sound of sympathy that somehow made it worse. Reverend Matthews stood with his Bible still open, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to find words appropriate for a situation that had no precedent in his years of service. Clara wanted to run, to disappear, to wake up and discover this was nothing more than a nightmare born from too much wedding anxiety. But she couldn't move. She stood there, drowning in humiliation, feeling every moment of her 26 years as evidence that she'd been a fool to hope for something better. "Let's go." "Clara," her father said gently, trying to turn her toward the side door, to spare her the walk back down the aisle past all those staring faces. That was when the voice came from the back of the church, rough and unused to speaking in public spaces. "Hold on." Every head turned. Silas Boone stood just inside the doors, still wearing his trail clothes, dust from the mountain road clinging to his boots and coat. He looked like he'd walked a long way that morning. his face weathered and tanned from years of sun and wind, his dark hair long enough to brush his collar. He was not a small man. His time in the mountains had given him a lean, hard strength that was evident even beneath his worn clothes. His eyes, dark and steady, fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her breath catch. "If he won't have her," Silas said, his voice carrying across the silent church. "I will." The gasps that followed were louder than the laughter had been. Clara stared at him, unable to process what she'd just heard. Her mind couldn't make sense of it. Silas Boone, the mountain man, the ghost who came to town 4 times a year and spoke to almost no one. He was walking down the aisle now, moving with a purpose that seemed to quiet even the whispers. When he reached the altar, he stopped and looked directly at Clara. "I mean it," he said, quieter now, meant just for her. "If you'll have me instead." Clara's voice had abandoned her. She could only stare at this stranger who wasn't quite a stranger. This man she'd seen but never really known, who was offering her something she couldn't quite understand. "You don't know her," Samuel said, his voice protective but uncertain. "I know enough," Silas replied, still looking at Clara. "I know she's kind. I know she's brave. I know she deserves better than being shamed in front of the whole town." Reverend Matthews found his voice. "This is highly irregular. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into as some sort of rescue." "Then ask her," Silas said. "Let her choose." Every eye in the church fixed on Clara, the moment stretched out, heavy with expectation and disbelief. In the silence, Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of her mother's dress, could sense the crossroads that had appeared in front of her with no warning. She could say no. She could flee the church and try to rebuild some shred of dignity from the ruins of this day. She could return to the boarding house and face the endless sympathy and whispered conversations that would follow her for years. Or she could say yes to a man she didn't know, who lived alone in the mountains, who was offering her something that made no logical sense, but felt, in this moment of complete devastation, like the only choice that wouldn't destroy her entirely. Clara looked at Silas Boone, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that Tommy's had never held. She saw steadiness. She saw certainty. She saw a man who had made up his mind and wouldn't be swayed by mockery or judgment. She nodded. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible, but Silas saw it. Reverend Matthews, after a long moment of internal debate and a glance at Mrs. Patterson, who gave him an almost imperceptible shrug, cleared his throat. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying resignation and something that might have been respect. "If this is truly what you both want, then let us proceed." The ceremony that followed was brief and surreal. Silas had no ring to offer, but he took Clara's hand in his palm rough with calluses but warm and steady, and spoke his vows in that same quiet, certain voice. Clara repeated her own vows in a whisper, still half convinced she was dreaming. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them man and wife, the church remained silent. No one clapped. No one offered congratulations. They simply sat and watched as Silas Boone, mountain man and stranger, took Clara Mae Holt by the hand and led her back down the aisle, past the staring faces, and out into the morning sunlight. A wagon waited outside, loaded with supplies. Silas helped Clara up onto the seat with surprising gentleness, then climbed up beside her. He took up the reins and, without a word to anyone, started the horses moving up the mountain road. Clara looked back once, seeing her father standing on the church steps, his face a mixture of shock and concern. She raised her hand in a small wave, and he returned it, his expression softening with something that looked like understanding. Then Redemption Creek disappeared behind them, and Clara found herself heading into the mountains with a husband she'd married in the space of 10 extraordinary minutes, leaving behind everything she'd known for something she couldn't begin to imagine. The letter arrived on a cool morning in early autumn, brought by a trapper passing through, who sometimes carried mail between the mountain settlements and the valley towns. Silas brought it in from where the man had left it, his expression troubled. "It's from your father," he said, handing the envelope to Clara. She recognized the handwriting immediately. her father's careful script, though shakier than she remembered. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was short, just a few lines on a single page. Clara, I cannot in good conscience maintain contact with a daughter who brought such shame upon our family. Your impulsive marriage to that mountain man, mere minutes after being rightfully rejected, showed a complete lack of moral judgment. I must ask you not to return to the boarding house or attempt further communication. You made your choice. Live with it. The words hit Clara like physical blows. She read them twice, 3 times, hoping she'd misunderstood, but the meaning remained brutally clear. Her father had disowned her, not for marrying Silas exactly, but for the manner of it, for the public spectacle, for choosing dignity over propriety. She stood frozen, the letter dangling from her hand, tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. Silas was beside her immediately, reading over her shoulder, his jaw tightening with anger. "He has no right," Silas said, his voice low and fierce. "No right to blame you for surviving what another man did to you." But Clara couldn't speak. The rejection was too complete, too final. Her father, the only family she had left, had cut her loose without even giving her a chance to explain, to tell him about the life she'd built, the contentment she'd found. He'd simply decided she was shameful and disposed of her accordingly. She sank into a chair, the letter falling to the floor, and wept. For the father she'd lost, for the relationship that had been imperfect but real, for the complete severing of her past life. She'd known the town judged her, but she'd hoped, foolishly, perhaps, that her own father would see past the circumstances to understand her choice. Silas knelt beside her chair, his hand hovering near her shoulder, uncertain. "Clara, I'm sorry. If I'd known this would cost you your family—" "Don't," Clara managed through her tears. "Don't apologize for being the only person who stood up for me. This is his choice, not yours." She felt Silas's hand finally settle on her shoulder, warm and steady. He didn't try to offer empty comfort or tell her it would be fine. He just stayed there, present and solid, while she grieved. Eventually the tears subsided, leaving Clara exhausted and hollow. She wiped her face with her apron and looked at Silas, seeing his own pain reflected back, not for himself, but for her. "Tell me about your family," she said suddenly. "Please, I need to know I'm not the only one who's lost people." Silas settled into the chair across from her, his expression distant with memory. "My parents died when I was 15. Influenza took them both within a week of each other. I had no other family, no siblings, no aunts or uncles close enough to take me in. I was alone." "What did you do?" "Survived," Silas said simply. "I worked odd jobs, lived rough, learned to rely on myself because there was no one else. The war came along when I was 18, and I joined up because at least the cavalry gave me food and a place to sleep. After the war, I couldn't settle back into regular life. I'd seen too much, lost too many people I'd learned to care about. So I came here, to the mountains, where being alone was a choice instead of a circumstance." "Were you lonely?" Clara asked. "Every day," Silas admitted, "but loneliness felt safer than connection. Connection meant eventually losing people, and I'd lost enough. I told myself I was content with solitude." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I was lying to myself." "When did you realize that?" "The day I saw you defend yourself to those ranch hands. I saw someone else who was alone, not by choice but by the cruelty of others, and who still maintained their dignity and kindness. I thought, if she can do that, maybe I'm wrong about solitude being the only safe choice." Clara reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture natural and unrehearsed. His fingers closed around hers, calloused and strong. "We're both orphans now," she said quietly. "Both alone except for each other. Is that enough?" Silas asked, and she heard the vulnerability in the question. "Can 2 broken, lonely people make something whole?" Clara thought about the past weeks, about the routines they'd built, the conversations that had grown easier and deeper, the comfort she found in his presence. She thought about the carved wolf sitting beside her bed, about the way he'd stood beside her in town, about his patience and kindness and unwavering respect. "I think we already are," she said. "Making something whole, I mean. It's not perfect or easy, but it's real. And it's ours. Silas brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made fresh tears spring to Clara's eyes. "Then we'll be family for each other. You and me. That's enough." They sat together as afternoon faded into evening, hands linked across the table, drawing strength from each other. Clara grieved for her father and the relationship that could have been, but she also felt something else growing in its place, a fierce determination to build the family she and Silas both deserved. When the light grew too dim to see clearly, Silas rose and lit lamps, then set about making dinner since Clara was too drained to manage it. She watched him move around the cabin, this man who'd been a stranger 2 months ago and who now felt essential to her existence. "Silas," she said, and he turned to look at her. "I'm glad I married you. Whatever my father thinks, whatever the town thinks, I don't regret choosing you." His expression softened, and she saw emotion flicker across his usually stoic face. "I'm glad too, more glad than I know how to say." That night a storm moved through the mountains, wind howling around the cabin and rain drumming on the roof. Clara lay in her loft, listening to the tempest outside, and thought about storms, how they cleared the air, how they washed things clean, how what came after was often better than what came before. She'd lost her father, but she'd gained a partner. She'd lost her old life, but she'd found a new one that fit better. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, and as she drifted towards sleep, Clara felt something shift inside her. The grief was still there, but beside it was something else, gratitude, hope, and the beginning of love for the man sleeping below, who'd given her shelter from every storm that mattered. 3 months into their marriage, Clara was organizing the cabin's small storage area when she found a metal box tucked behind supplies on a high shelf. It was the kind of box meant for important papers, fireproof and locked, though the key hung on a nearby nail, as if Silas had nothing to hide. She should have left it alone. Privacy was one of the foundations of their partnership, and Silas had never pried into her personal belongings. But curiosity got the better of her, and she told herself she was only organizing, only making sure everything was in order. Inside the box, she found Silas's military discharge papers, a few letters from long ago, and underneath it all, a land deed. Clara pulled it out, expecting to see Silas's name as sole owner of the mountain property. But what she found made her breath catch. The deed listed 2 names, Silas Boone and Clara Mae Boone. It was dated 6 weeks ago, shortly after their wedding. Silas had gone to the territorial office and legally added her name to the property deed, making her co-owner of everything he possessed. Clara's hands trembled as she held the document. He'd done this without telling her, without asking for anything in return, without any guarantee that their arrangement would work out. He'd given her legal claim to his home, his land, his life's work, and never mentioned it once. She was still standing there, stunned, when Silas returned from checking the trapline. He saw her holding the deed and went very still. "I'm sorry," Clara said quickly. "I was organizing and found the box. I shouldn't have looked." "It's fine," Silas said, setting down his pack. "You were bound to find it eventually. I should have told you. Why didn't you?" He moved to the table and sat down, gesturing for her to join him. Clara brought the deed with her, placing it between them like evidence in a trial. "Because I didn't want you to feel obligated," Silas said finally. "I didn't want you to think I was trying to buy your affection or trap you here with legal ties. I just wanted you to have security. To know that if something happened to me, or if you decided you couldn't stand living here anymore, you'd have something, options, a future." "When did you do this?" Clara asked. 2 weeks after we married. I took the wagon to the territorial office in Silver Creek, told them I wanted my wife's name on the deed. But you barely knew me. What if I'd been horrible? What if I'd taken everything and left?" Silas smiled slightly. "Then I'd have been a fool. But I didn't think you would. I'd watched you for 3 years, Clara. I saw how you treated people, how you managed your father's business, how you handled cruelty with dignity. I knew your character, even if I didn't know your favorite color or how you took your coffee." Clara felt tears building again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed over her father's letter. These were tears of overwhelming gratitude and something else, something warm and expanding in her chest. Why, though? Really, why? This is more than kindness. This is more than partnership. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped on the table. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, each word chosen with deliberation. Do you remember that day at the Mercantile, when those ranch hands were giving you trouble? You mentioned it before. When we first talked on the wagon, what I didn't tell you was what happened after. You walked away, and one of those men made to follow you. I stepped into view, made sure he saw me, and he decided to find other entertainment. Silas looked up, meeting her eyes. I followed you all the way back to the boarding house that day, making sure you got home safe. You never knew I was there, Clara's breath caught. You protected me. Even then, I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd said to them. About character. About how some things can be changed and others can't. You were right and you were brave and you were alone. I was alone too, but by choice. You were alone because people couldn't see past their own shallow judgments. He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers, waiting. Clara closed the distance, placing her hand in his. I went back to my cabin that day and thought about you for weeks. Every time I came to town after that, I'd see you at the boarding house or the church. Always kind, always graceful, always being more than people gave you credit for. And I'd think, that's a woman who deserves better than what this town offers. So you came to my wedding, Clara said, understanding dawning. You came hoping to see me happy. I did. I told myself, if you were happy with Tommy Grier, if he could give you the life you deserved, then I'd be content knowing at least one good person in this world got something good. Silas's jaw tightened. When he rejected you, when I saw him humiliate you in front of everyone, something in me just broke. I couldn't let that be the end of your story. I couldn't let him take your dignity, so you offered to marry me. I'd been half in love with you for 3 years, Clara. I just didn't have the courage to do anything about it until that moment. And even then, I told myself it was just about helping you, about giving you an escape. But the truth is, I was hoping that maybe, given time, you might come to care for me too. That maybe we could build something real. Clara's vision blurred with tears. She thought Silas married her out of pity or kindness, out of some noble impulse to rescue her. She hadn't imagined that he'd been watching her, caring about her for years before he ever spoke to her. That's why you added my name to the deed, she whispered. Not just for security. Because you meant it when you said partnership. Because you loved me before we ever stood at that altar together. Yes, Silas said simply. I loved you then and I love you now. I don't expect you to feel the same. I know this arrangement is practical for you, and that's fine. But I wanted you to know the truth. You deserve truth. Clara stood, and Silas's expression flickered with worry, as if he thought he'd said too much, pushed too hard. Instead, she walked around the table and stood beside him. He looked up at her, uncertainty clear in his dark eyes. Stand up, she said softly. He did, and Clara reached up to cup his weathered face in her hands. She'd touched him before. Casual contacts, helping with chores, passing tools, but never like this. Never with intention and tenderness. I was so focused on surviving, she said, on getting through each day without falling apart, that I didn't let myself feel what was growing between us. I told myself this was practical, temporary, just an arrangement that worked for both of us. But it's not, is it? It hasn't been for a while now. Clara, Silas started, but she shook her head. Let me finish. You've been honest with me. Let me be honest with you. She took a breath, steadying herself. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the first night here, when you promised to give me space and time. Maybe it was watching you teach me to shoot, patient with every mistake. Maybe it was the carved wolf, or standing beside me in town, or the way you make coffee in the morning because you know I'm slow to wake. But somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement and started thinking of it as a marriage. A real one. With the man I've come to love. Silas's hands came up to cover hers, his eyes searching her face. You mean that? I've never meant anything more. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. You saw worth in me when the whole world said I had none. You gave me not just shelter but dignity. How could I not love you for that? How could I not love the man who's been nothing but good and kind and patient? I never wanted you to feel obligated. This isn't obligation, Clara interrupted. This is choice, my choice. The same choice you made 3 months ago in that church, only now I'm making it with full knowledge and a whole heart. I choose you, Silas Boone. I choose this marriage. I choose us. He kissed her then, or maybe she kissed him. It didn't matter who moved first. What mattered was the warmth of it, the rightness, the sense of something that had been building finally reaching its natural conclusion. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Clara saw her own emotions reflected in Silas's face. Joy, relief, love. I want to be your wife, Clara said clearly. In every way, not just in name. I want to share your bed, your life, your future, all of it. If you still want that. Clara, I've wanted that since the day I married you, Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. I just didn't want to rush you or make you feel pressured. I'm not rushed. I'm not pressured. I'm ready. I've been ready for weeks now, I think. I just didn't let myself admit it until now. That night, Clara didn't climb to the loft. She stayed with Silas in the bed he'd given up for her, and what passed between them was tender and true, a consummation not just of bodies, but of hearts that had found each other against all odds. In the morning, Clara woke wrapped in Silas's arms, sunlight streaming through the cabin windows, and felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This was what marriage was supposed to be, not obligation or appearance, but genuine partnership built on respect, trust, and love. Good morning, wife, Silas murmured against her hair. Good morning, husband, Clara replied, and felt the truth of those words settle deep in her bones. They'd started as strangers, bound by necessity and kindness. They'd become partners learning to navigate life together. And now, finally, they were what they'd promised to be that day in church, husband and wife in truth, bound by love that had grown slowly and carefully in the shelter of the mountains, away from the judgment and cruelty of the world below. The deed still lay on the table where Clara had left it, legal proof of what her heart already knew. Silas had given her everything he had to give, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he loved her. And now she could give him what she had to offer in return, her love, her life, her whole self, freely chosen and freely given. It was, Clara thought as she held her husband close, the perfect foundation for whatever came next. For 3 weeks after their declaration of love, Clara and Silas existed in a state of quiet happiness. The cabin felt different now, warmer, more complete. They worked side by side during the day and fell asleep wrapped around each other at night. Clara had never known that marriage could feel like this, that another person could become so essential to her sense of home and safety. It was late autumn, with winter approaching fast. The first snows had already dusted the highest peaks, and Silas spent his days preparing for the hard months ahead, chopping extra wood, checking the cabin for drafts, making sure their supplies were adequate. Clara preserved what remained from the garden and organized their stores with the same efficiency she'd once brought to the boarding house. They were working together outside one afternoon, Clara hanging laundry, while Silas repaired a section of fence when a rider appeared on the trail. Both of them tensed. Visitors were rare this late in the season, and unexpected arrivals often meant trouble. The rider was young, barely more than a boy, riding hard and looking terrified. He pulled up his horse near the cabin, nearly falling from the saddle in his haste. Mr. Boone. Silas Boone, he gasped out. I'm Boone, Silas said, moving forward. What's wrong? I'm Billy Carson, from Redemption Creek. The sheriff sent me. There's trouble coming. Bad trouble? Clara came to stand beside Silas as the boy caught his breath. She fetched him water from the well, and he drank gratefully before continuing. There's a gang, the Dalton Gang, led by a man called Black Jack Dalton. They hit 3 towns south of us in the last month. Burned buildings, killed people who resisted, took everything of value. Word came yesterday that they're headed our way. When? Silas asked, his voice gone hard and military. 3 days, maybe 4. The sheriff, he's old, Mr. Boone. Never dealt with anything worse than Saturday night drunks. He doesn't know what to do, and we got no deputies. Someone remembered you were cavalry in the war, that you know about fighting. The town council sent me to ask if you'd help. Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. She looked at Silas and saw something she'd never seen before. Not the gentle man who carved wood and made her coffee, but the soldier he'd been, calculating and assessing. How many in the gang? Silas asked. Reports say 15 to 20 men, all armed and mean. And Redemption Creek has what for defense? Maybe 30 men who can hold a rifle, but most of them are storekeepers and farmers. We're not fighters, Mr. Boone. We're going to get massacred unless someone helps us. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. Clara could see the war happening inside him, the desire to stay safe and isolated versus whatever sense of duty or conscience was pulling at him. They'll die, Billy said desperately. My ma, my sisters, everyone, please. Go inside, Silas said to the boy. Clara will get you some food. I need to think. Billy dismounted and went with Clara into the cabin. She fed him leftover stew and bread while he told her more details, how the gang had left survivors in the other towns only to spread word of their cruelty, how they seemed to take pleasure in violence, how everyone in Redemption Creek was terrified. Outside, Silas stood alone, staring at the mountains. Clara watched him through the window, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. When Billy had eaten his fill and gone to tend his horse, Clara joined Silas outside. You're thinking about helping them, she said. I don't want to, Silas admitted. I left that life behind. I came here to escape violence, not run toward it, but you're going to do it anyway. He turned to look at her, pain clear in his eyes. They're defenseless, Clara. I have skills I wish I didn't have, but I have them. If I don't help and people die when I could have prevented it, I'll never forgive myself. Clara understood, even as fear clutched at her heart. This was who Silas was, a good man who couldn't turn away from people in need, even people who judged and dismissed him. Then we'll help them, she said. We? Silas shook his head. No, I'll go down there, help them prepare, but you're staying here where it's safe. That town is full of people who mocked me, who laughed at my humiliation, Clara said carefully. I have every reason to want nothing to do with them. But there are good people there too. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Henderson, children like Billy who haven't done anything wrong. And more than that, Silas, I'm not the woman I was 3 months ago. I'm stronger now, braver. You helped me find that. So if you're going down there to face danger, I'm going with you. Clara, I'm your wife, she said firmly. Your partner? We face things together. That's what we promised, isn't it? I'm not staying here while you walk into danger alone. She could see him wanting to argue, wanting to protect her, but also understanding that she was right. They were partners, and that meant sharing the hard things as well as the good. You'll stay safe, he said finally. You'll stay with the women and children, not on the front lines. I'll do what's needed, Clara countered. Same as you. Silas pulled her close, holding her tight. I never wanted to bring you into this kind of danger. You didn't. The Dalton gang did. We're just responding to it. She pulled back to look at him. Tell me true, Silas. Can you help them? Can you organize a defense that might work? Maybe, he said. If they'll listen to me. If we have enough time. It's not about having more guns than them. It's about using terrain surprise strategy. I can teach them that much. Whether it'll be enough against 15 hardened outlaws? I don't know. They told Billy they'd come at dawn. The boy was so relieved he nearly wept, thanking them over and over before riding back down the mountain with the news. That night, Clara and Silas lay in bed, holding each other in the darkness. Neither could sleep, both aware that they were about to step into something that could cost them everything. I need to tell you something, Silas said quietly. About the war. About who I was. Clara waited, feeling the tension in his body. I was good at killing, he said bluntly. Too good. I could track anyone, predict their movements, set ambushes that left entire squads dead before they knew we were there. My commanding officers praised me for it. Other soldiers feared me. But I knew what I was becoming, something cold and efficient and not quite human. That's why I came to the mountains. I needed to remember how to be a man instead of a weapon. "You are a man," Clara said firmly. "A good man who did hard things in a hard time. That doesn't define you. It might after this. If I tap back into that part of myself to protect Redemption Creek, I might not be able to put it away again. You might see a side of me that frightens you." Clara thought about this, about the soldier Silas had been, and the man he'd become. "I'm not afraid of who you were, Silas. I'm grateful that you survived it and found your way to something better. If you have to use those skills now to protect innocent people, that's not becoming a weapon again. That's being a protector. There's a difference. I hope you still think so when this is over," Silas said. They rose before dawn, packing quickly. Silas gathered weapons, his rifle, 2 pistols, his cavalry saber wrapped in oilcloth, and checked them with practiced efficiency. Clara packed supplies, medical materials, anything that might be useful in what was coming. Before they left, Silas stopped at the shelf where he kept his few precious belongings. He pulled out a small metal case and opened it, revealing a tarnished silver medal. "What is that?" Clara asked. "Commendation for valor. They gave it to me after a particularly brutal engagement. I've kept it hidden because it reminds me of the worst parts of war. But maybe I need to remember what I'm capable of, just this once." He pinned the medal inside his coat over his heart, where no one else would see it. Clara understood the gesture, not display, but private acknowledgement that he was about to become the soldier again, at least temporarily. They loaded the wagon with supplies and started down the mountain as the sun rose. Clara looked back once at their cabin, nestled safe among the trees, and prayed they'd both return to it. "Whatever happens," she said, "we face it together." "Together," Silas agreed, taking her hand. The journey down was quiet, both of them lost in thought. As they descended into the valley and Redemption Creek came into view, Clara could see people gathering in the street, watching their approach. The whole town had turned out, it seemed, waiting to see if the mountain man would save them. Sheriff Cooper, a gray-haired man with kind eyes but trembling hands, met them at the edge of town. "Thank God you came. We've been preparing as best we can, but—" "Show me what you've got," Silas said, his voice different now, harder, commanding. "Show me the town layout, tell me where the gang will likely approach from, and introduce me to every man who can hold a weapon." The sheriff nodded and led them toward the church, which had become the impromptu command center. As they walked, Clara saw familiar faces, some sympathetic, some ashamed, many simply grateful. Mrs. Patterson hurried up to them. "Clara, dear, we're organizing the women and children. We'll need your help." "Of course," Clara said, but she kept glancing at Silas, who was already studying the town with a tactical eye, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and strategies. Tommy Grier was there too, holding a rifle awkwardly, looking pale and frightened. When he saw Clara and Silas, something like shame crossed his face, but he nodded respectfully. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Silas transformed from gentle mountain man to something harder and more focused. He organized the townsmen into groups, assigned positions, created fallback points and defensive lines. He taught them to shoot from cover, to create crossfire zones, to use what little they had as efficiently as possible. Clara worked with the women, preparing medical supplies, organizing food and water, creating safe spaces for children, and making sure everyone knew the evacuation plan if the worst happened. She also insisted on learning to shoot from defensive positions, despite Mrs. Patterson's protests. "If it comes to the church," Clara said firmly, "I'm not cowering helplessly. I'm defending the children alongside everyone else." On the 3rd evening, scouts reported the gang was half a day away. They'd arrive at dawn. Silas called everyone together in the church for final instructions. Clara watched her husband stand before the townspeople who'd once dismissed him, now hanging on his every word. "I won't lie to you," Silas said. "Tomorrow will be hard. Some of you might not survive it. But if we stay organized, if we trust each other and follow the plan, we have a chance. Remember, they expect you to be easy prey. We're going to show them they're wrong." After the meeting, as people dispersed to their positions, Clara found Silas checking weapons one last time. He'd looked tired but focused, every inch the cavalry scout he'd once been. "Are we ready?" she asked. "As ready as we can be. The rest depends on luck and courage." He pulled her close. "Stay safe tomorrow, Clara, promise me. Only if you promise the same. I promise to do everything I can to come back to you," he said. "Because our life together up in those mountains is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm not giving that up without a fight." They held each other as night fell over Redemption Creek, knowing that dawn would bring violence and uncertainty, but facing it together as they'd promised, as partners, as husband and wife, as two people who'd found love in the unlikeliest of circumstances and refused to let it go. Dawn broke cold and clear over Redemption Creek. Clara stood at a second-floor window of the church, rifle in hand, watching the eastern road where the gang would approach. Around her, other women maintained their positions, faces pale but determined. Below, in carefully arranged defensive positions throughout the town, Silas's makeshift militia waited. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the nervous shifting of feet and the occasional whispered prayer. Clara's mother's locket hung around her neck, the familiar weight a comfort against her skin. She'd worn it on her wedding day to Tommy, worn it on her actual wedding day to Silas, and she wore it now, hoping it would bring her luck one more time. The Dalton gang appeared just after sunrise, riding in loose formation, 15 men as reported. Even from a distance, Clara could see the confidence in their bearing. They'd done this before, raided helpless towns and faced no real resistance. They expected today to be the same. Black Jack Dalton rode at the front, a big man with a dark beard and guns on both hips. His men spread out as they entered town, looking for targets, for victims, for entertainment. They didn't know that behind every window, every corner, every carefully arranged barrier, armed men waited with fingers on triggers. Silas had been clear about the plan. Let them get into town. Let them think they'd found another easy target. Then hit them from all sides at once, break their formation, make them panic. It was guerrilla tactics, the kind Silas had used in the war, and it required perfect timing and nerve. Clara watched as the gang reached the center of town, near the dry goods store. Dalton raised his hand, signaling his men to spread out and start their work. That was the moment Silas had chosen, when they were grouped but starting to separate. When they were focused on their intended victims rather than their own defense. The first shot came from the feed store, dropped one of the gang members from his horse. Before the sound had finished echoing, a dozen more shots rang out from windows, rooftops, and doorways. The carefully aimed crossfire caught the gang completely by surprise. Men fell from their horses. Shouts of alarm turned to screams of pain. The gang's confidence shattered in seconds as they realized they'd ridden into a trap. Horses reared and panicked, throwing riders. The gang members who stayed mounted tried to return fire, but they couldn't see where the shots were coming from. Black Jack Dalton roared orders, trying to rally his men, but Silas's plan was working perfectly. The gang was trapped in a killing zone, with no clear enemy to fight, no target to charge. They were being picked apart by an invisible enemy, and their training failed them. Clara saw Silas moving between positions on the ground level, directing fire, adjusting the defense. He moved with absolute confidence, every gesture precise, and the townsmen followed his orders without hesitation. This was what he'd been in the war, a leader who inspired trust even in chaos. 3 gang members broke away, trying to escape back down the East Road. Silas had predicted this too. More shots rang out from positions at the edge of town, and 2 of the 3 fell. The last made it out of range, fleeing at full gallop. "Hold your positions!" Silas's voice cut through the gunfire. "Don't pursue. Maintain the defensive lines." The gang was breaking now, completely routed. Those still on horseback wheeled and tried to find escape routes, only to meet more fire from unexpected angles. The few who dismounted and tried to take cover found themselves isolated and surrounded. Black Jack Dalton, seeing his operation collapsing, made a desperate charge toward the church. Perhaps he thought taking hostages would give him leverage. Perhaps he was simply enraged beyond reason. He rode hard, pistols firing wildly, his face twisted with fury. Silas stepped into the street, rifle raised. The shot was clean and final. Dalton fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader killed, lost whatever fight they had left. Some threw down their weapons. Others simply ran, spurring their horses out of town in any direction that seemed safe. In less than 10 minutes it was over. The Dalton gang, feared across 3 territories, had been shattered by a mountain man and a town of storekeepers and farmers who'd finally found their courage. Clara's hands were shaking so hard she had to set her rifle down. She hadn't fired a shot. The gang had never made it close enough to the church to require her to, but the tension and fear of those minutes had left her exhausted. Mrs. Patterson touched her shoulder. "It's over, we won. Because of you and your husband, we won." Clara looked down into the street, where Silas was organizing men to secure the captured gang members and tend to the wounded. Even in victory, he was calm and methodical, making sure nothing was overlooked. But she could see the cost in the set of his shoulders, the grim expression on his face. He'd done what needed doing, but it had required him to become the weapon again. And she knew he'd carry that weight. Clara descended from the church to find the street transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Townsmen were securing prisoners, checking fallen gang members, and tending to the few defenders who'd been wounded in the brief but intense fight. Miraculously, no one from Redemption Creek had been killed, though several men nursed minor wounds. She found Silas near the dry goods store, kneeling beside a young man, one of the gang members who'd been shot but survived. The outlaw couldn't have been more than 20, and he was crying, begging Silas not to kill him. "You'll live," Silas said, his voice flat and professional. "But you need medical attention. Clara, can you help him?" It struck Clara then, the depth of Silas's character. He'd just fought a battle against these men, seen them try to destroy his adopted town, and yet he showed mercy to the wounded. He could have left them to bleed, and few would have blamed him. Instead, he was ensuring they received care. "I'll get Mrs. Patterson and the medical supplies," Clara said, touching Silas's shoulder briefly. He nodded, but didn't look at her, his attention still on assessing wounded men and organizing the aftermath. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Clara and the other women treated wounds, both minor and serious. The captured gang members, 7 in total, were locked in the general store's cellar under guard. The dead, including Blackjack Dalton, were laid out in the livery stable pending burial or whatever the law required. Sheriff Cooper, who'd followed Silas's orders throughout the fight, now stood in the street, looking simultaneously relieved and overwhelmed. "I need to send for the territorial marshal. This is beyond my authority. But Silas, I have to say, you saved this town. We'd all be dead or worse without you." "Not just me," Silas said. "Every man who held his position, who trusted the plan even when they were afraid. They saved themselves." It was typical of Silas to deflect credit, but the townspeople knew the truth. Word spread quickly of how the mountain man had organized the defense, how his tactics had turned certain massacre into decisive victory. People sought him out to thank him, to shake his hand, to apologize for how they'd treated him before. Silas accepted it all with quiet dignity, but Clara could see the toll it was taking on him. He'd had to access the part of himself he'd tried to bury, and now that the danger had passed, the weight of what he'd done, even in defense of innocence, was settling on his shoulders. Tommy Grier approached them in the late afternoon, his rifle still in hand, his face showing the shock of someone who'd seen violence for the first time. "Mr. Boone, I wanted to say thank you, and I'm sorry, for everything." Silas studied him for a moment. "You held your position today. You did your part. That's what matters now." Tommy nodded, then turned to Clara. "I was a fool. I see that now. You deserve everything you've found with him. I hope you're happy." "I am," Clara said simply. "I hope you find happiness too, Tommy. Real happiness, not based on what others think." He walked away, and Clara felt the last thread of her old life finally snap. She'd faced the town that had mocked her, defended it alongside her husband, and earned respect through courage rather than appearance. That chapter was closed. As evening approached, the townspeople gathered in the church for a meeting. Reverend Matthews stood at the front, but it was clear everyone was looking to Silas. "We owe you a debt we can never repay," the Reverend said. "If there's anything we can do, anything at all, you need only ask." Silas stood, uncomfortable with the attention but knowing he needed to speak. "I don't want payment, but I do want something. I want you to remember what you learned today. You're not helpless. You're not victims. When you stood together and trusted each other, you were strong enough to face anything. Don't forget that." He paused, then continued, his voice softer. "And I want you to remember my wife. She chose to come down here with me to help you, even though many of you mocked her. She organized the women, prepared supplies, and stood ready to defend the children if it came to that. She has more courage than most men I've known. Remember that the next time you're tempted to judge someone by how they look rather than who they are." The church was silent. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as Silas continued. "We'll be returning to our mountain tomorrow. Our life is there, not here. But if you ever face trouble again, send word. We're part of this community whether we live in town or not." As the meeting ended and people filed out, many stopped to speak with Clara, not with pity or condescension, but with genuine respect and gratitude. Mrs. Patterson embraced her. Mr. Henderson pressed a package of supplies into her hands as thanks. Even people who'd once laughed at her humiliation now apologized and wished her well. That night, Clara and Silas stayed in one of the boarding house rooms, her father's old place, now run by a widow who'd taken it over. As they prepared for bed, Clara finally saw Silas let down his guard. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and she saw him shaking. She knelt before him, taking his hands in hers. "Silas, what is it?" "I killed men today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it was necessary. I know they would have killed innocents if I hadn't stopped them. But I still took lives, and I can't pretend that doesn't matter." "It matters that it bothers you," Clara said firmly. "That's what makes you different from them. You didn't kill for pleasure or profit. You protected the innocent. There's no sin in that. I thought I'd left that man behind," Silas said. "The soldier, the killer. But he was still there, just waiting." "No," Clara insisted. "The soldier was there, yes, but not the killer, the protector, the leader, the man who showed mercy even to his enemies. That's who you are, Silas. That's who you've always been." She pulled him close, holding him as he processed the day's events. As he struggled with the violence he'd committed and the lives he'd saved, they stayed that way for a long time, taking comfort from each other. Two people who'd found love in unexpected places and who now faced the aftermath of hard choices together. Tomorrow they'd return to their mountain, to their cabin, and their quiet life. But tonight they held each other in the darkness and reminded themselves that they'd come through the fire intact, that their love had survived not just humiliation and hardship, but violence and fear. If it could survive all that, Clara thought, it could survive anything. 3 days after the battle, Clara and Silas stood at the edge of Redemption Creek, their wagon loaded and ready for the journey back to the mountains. The territorial marshal had come and gone, taking the captured gang members with him and formally thanking Silas for his service. The town had returned to its normal rhythms, though with a new sense of confidence and unity. The townspeople had gathered to see them off, not all of them, but enough that Clara felt the weight of their gratitude and respect. Mrs. Patterson pressed a basket of preserves into Clara's hands. Mr. Henderson gave Silas a new set of carving tools, finer than any he'd owned. Others offered supplies, thanks, and genuine affection. Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his Bible in hand. "Before you go, I wonder if I might say a few words." Silas nodded, and the Reverend addressed the gathered crowd. When Clara Mae Holt stood at this town's altar months ago, she faced humiliation at what should have been her happiest moment. We witnessed it. Some of us participated in it. We judged her, dismissed her, and failed to see the strength and goodness in her heart. He paused, letting the words settle over the silent crowd. Then Silas Boone, a man we barely knew and certainly didn't understand, showed us what real character looks like. He offered dignity when the rest of us offered only shame. And together they've taught us more about courage, compassion, and worth than any sermon I've ever preached. They came down from their mountain to save a town that hadn't earned their help, and they did it because that's who they are. So I say to all of you, remember this. Remember that true worth isn't found in appearance or status or wealth. It's found in character, and by that measure, Mr. and Mrs. Boone are among the richest people I've ever known. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as Reverend Matthews turned to them. Go with God's blessing. Your home is in the mountains, but you'll always have a place here if you need it. Her father appeared then, emerging from the back of the crowd. Samuel Holt looked older than Clara remembered, more stooped, his face lined with regret. He approached slowly, hat in hands. Clara, he said, his voice rough. I was wrong. About everything. About you, about your marriage, about what matters in life. I let pride and shame cloud my judgment, and I disowned the best thing in my life. I can't ask you to forgive me, but I can tell you I'm sorry. Deeply, truly sorry. Clara looked at her father. At the man who'd raised her alone after her mother died, who'd loved her in his flawed human way, and who'd let fear of judgment override his love for his daughter. She could hold on to anger, could make him suffer as she'd suffered. But she'd learned something in the mountains about the weight of carrying grudges. I forgive you, Papa, she said quietly. But things are different now. I have a life, a home, a husband. I'm not the same person who left here months ago. I can see that, Samuel said, his eyes taking in the confidence in her bearing, the love evident between her and Silas. You're stronger, happier. I'm glad for it, even if it means I lost you to find it. You didn't lose me, Clara said. But you can't have me on the old terms either. If we rebuild our relationship, it'll be as equals, as two adults who respect each other. Can you accept that? Samuel nodded, tears in his own eyes. I can try. That's all I can promise. Then we'll start there, Clara said. She stepped forward and embraced her father briefly, then stepped back to stand beside Silas, making clear where her primary loyalty lay. The town presented them with one final gift, a carved wooden sign that Mr. Henderson's son had made. It showed a mountain and valley together, connected and interdependent, with the words Redemption Creek carved in careful letters. For your cabin, Mr. Henderson explained. So you remember you're part of something bigger. Even up there in the mountains, Silas accepted the sign with visible emotion, nodding his thanks, since words seemed to fail him. As they climbed onto the wagon, young Billy Carson ran up one last time. Mr. Boone, Mrs. Boone, when I'm grown, can I come visit you? Learn from you? You're welcome anytime, Silas said. But Billy, remember what you learned here. You don't need me to teach you courage. You already have it. You rode up that mountain alone to ask for help when you were terrified. That's real bravery. The boy beamed, standing taller, and Clara saw the future in him. A young man who'd faced fear and come through it changed for the better. They rode out of town as the sun climbed higher, taking the mountain trail at an easy pace. Neither spoke for the first hour, both processing the goodbye, the changed relationship with the town, the weight of what they'd accomplished together. Finally, as the pines closed around them and the air grew clearer, Clara spoke. Are you all right, really? I am, Silas said, and she heard truth in it. I made peace with what happened. I did what I had to do, and I can live with that. More importantly, I'm going home with you, and that's all that matters. They reached the cabin in late afternoon, smoke still rising from the carefully banked fire they'd left. Everything was as they'd left it, peaceful and isolated and perfect. Clara climbed down from the wagon and stood in the clearing, breathing in the mountain air. Feeling the tension of the past days drain away, Silas came to stand beside her, and together they looked at their home, small, simple, but entirely theirs. I have something to tell you, Clara said, turning to face him. I've been feeling different the past few weeks. Tired in the mornings, certain foods making me queasy. I think I'm pregnant, Silas. I think we're going to have a child. His expression transformed from surprise to wonder to pure joy in the space of seconds. He pulled her close, gentle and reverent. his hand moving to her stomach, as if he could already feel the life growing there. "A child," he whispered. "Our child, are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer in his face. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Grateful, amazed, terrified, all of it at once. They stood together as the sun set, painting the mountains in gold and crimson. Inside the cabin, the fire waited to be built up. The loft was still Clara's space, though she rarely used it now, preferring to sleep in Silas's arms. The carved wolf sat on its shelf, a reminder of love offered carefully and accepted fully. The land deed bearing both their names hung in a frame Silas had made, legal proof and emotional truth combined. "Tell me," Silas said, settling beside the fire later that evening. Clara wrapped in a blanket beside him. "Do you ever regret it? The way we started? The humiliation that brought us together?" Clara thought about that terrible day at the altar, about Tommy's rejection and the laughter of the crowd. She thought about the months since, the slow building of trust, the discovery of love, the quiet happiness of their mountain life, and the courage they'd found in facing danger together. "No," she said finally, "not for a moment. That humiliation was the worst thing that ever happened to me and the best thing. It broke me open and let something better grow in the broken places. It brought me to you, to this life, to more happiness than I knew existed. So no, I don't regret it. I'm grateful for it. So am I," Silas said, kissing her forehead. "Every moment of it, because it led us here." Outside, winter's first snow began to fall, blanketing the mountains in white. Inside, the fire crackled warm and bright, and two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way held each other close, looking toward a future they'd build together, a future of love and family and the quiet dignity of lives well lived. Some humiliations, Clara thought as she drifted toward sleep, really do change everything. They changed not just one life, but showed an entire town what truly matters. And in the end, the worst day of her life had become the doorway to the best life she could have imagined. She'd been refused at the altar, but she'd been claimed by something far more valuable, real love, offered freely by a man who saw her worth when the world couldn't. That was enough, more than enough. That was everything.